Eve wandered through the garden alone, her fingers trailing along branches heavy with fruit. She drifted away from Adam during their work, absorbed in the beauty around her. A flicker of concern crossed her mind. The angels had specifically warned her about separating from her husband, but she quickly dismissed it. After all, what danger could possibly exist in paradise? That small decision, that moment of ignoring divine counsel, was exactly what Satan had been waiting for. Because before he ever spoke a word to deceive Eve, he'd already won half the battle by getting her alone. And what happened next in the Garden of Eden reveals a calculated attack that's still being used against humanity today.
Here's what you need to understand about Satan's state of mind when he entered Eden. He was absolutely seething with rage. He'd lost everything. Heaven, his position, his glory, the bliss of God's presence, all of it, gone forever. And when he looked at Adam and Eve living in perfect happiness, enjoying the very things he'd forfeited, it drove him mad with envy. Satan couldn't strike back at God directly anymore. He'd been cast out of heaven for that rebellion, so he hatched a different plan. If he couldn't hurt God, he'd hurt the beings God loved. He would drag humanity down into his own misery, corrupt God's perfect creation, and establish his own kingdom right here on earth in opposition to the Creator. But here's the thing, Adam and Eve knew he was out there. They'd been explicitly warned. Heavenly messengers had opened up Satan's entire backstory to them, how he fell, why he fell, and what his plots against them were. They understood that this fallen angel would try to destroy them if given the chance. The angels made it crystal clear that as long as Adam and Eve stayed obedient to God, Satan couldn't harm them. Every angel in heaven would come to their aid if necessary. But there was one condition. They had to resist his first attempts at deception. If they yielded even once to temptation, their nature would become so corrupted that they'd lose the power to resist him. One wrong choice, and they'd be helpless against him. Now, you might be wondering why God allowed Satan to tempt them at all. That's a massive question with answers that shake the foundations of everything, and we're going to tackle that in a future video, because it deserves its full attention. Subscribe so you don't miss it, because understanding why God allows evil changes everything. It transformed my perspective on Jesus and on life, and it might do the same for you. But for now, just know this. Satan had access to them at only one location, the forbidden tree. As long as they stayed away from investigating that tree, they'd be safe. And this brings us to Satan's first move in his strategy to destroy them. Satan had studied Adam and Eve carefully. He knew their routines, their habits, how they worked together cultivating the garden. And he noticed something crucial. Eve's guard was lower when she was alone. She was easier to approach, easier to engage, and easier to manipulate without Adam there to provide another perspective. So he waited, patiently. Like a predator stalking prey, he watched for the perfect moment, and it came. Eve, absorbed in her pleasant work, unconsciously wandered from Adam's side. The moment she realized she was alone, she felt that apprehension of danger. Her mind flashed to the angel's warning, but then she made a fatal calculation. She decided she had sufficient wisdom and strength to discern evil and resist it on her own. This is where we need to pause and recognize what was happening in Eve's mind. She wasn't being stupid or reckless. She was overestimating herself. She'd never experienced deception before. She'd never known danger. In her innocence, she couldn't fully grasp what she was up against. It's like a child who's been warned about strangers but has never actually encountered a predator. The warning feels theoretical until it's too late. Satan understood this perfectly. He knew that isolation breeds overconfidence. When you're alone with your thoughts, without someone to reality check your reasoning, you can talk yourself into almost anything. And Eve was about to talk herself into disaster. But Satan still had a major problem to solve before he could even speak to her. Satan knew he couldn't approach Eve as himself. She'd been warned about a fallen angel trying to ruin them. So if some menacing figure appeared, she'd run straight back to Adam. So Satan needed a medium, a disguise so perfect that Eve's defenses would completely drop. He chose the serpent. As quoted in Genesis 3 verse 1, it was more cunning than any animal of the field which the Lord God had made. To put it into perspective, this wasn't the cursed, ground-slithering creature we know today. Back then, the serpent was magnificent. It had wings and flew through the air with dazzling brightness, its scales gleaming with the color and brilliance of burnished gold. It was one of the wisest and most beautiful creatures on earth. Satan positioned this gorgeous creature in the branches of the forbidden tree, casually eating its fruit. When Eve's eyes landed on it, she wasn't afraid. She was fascinated. Here was this stunning animal, perched in the one tree she'd been told to avoid, enjoying its fruit without any apparent consequences. It was psychological manipulation at its finest. The forbidden tree suddenly seemed less dangerous when this beautiful creature was treating it like a snack bar. And when the serpent spoke, when Eve heard it actually talk, she was startled but intrigued. If the serpent had looked like an angel, she might have been suspicious. But a beautiful animal speaking? That just seemed magical, not menacing. Satan had successfully disguised his true character. He'd made himself appear not just harmless, but wonderful. And that's exactly how deception still works today. The most dangerous lies don't announce themselves as lies. They come wrapped in beauty, charm, and the appearance of enhancement. But getting Eve's attention was just step one. Now Satan had to get her to question everything she knew. Satan didn't immediately tell Eve to eat the fruit. That would have triggered her defenses. Instead, he asked the question, as if genuinely curious. Has God really said you can't eat from every tree of the garden? Notice the genius here. He knew exactly what God had said, but he phrased it to make God's one prohibition sound unreasonable. God had given them an entire garden full of trees, thousands of options, and restricted just one. But Satan reframed it to sound like God was withholding something, being restrictive, limiting their freedom. Eve took the bait. She started explaining, as you can see in Genesis 3, verse 3, she says, "We can eat from the trees of the garden, but from the tree in the middle, God said we shouldn't eat it, or even touch it, or we'll die." Notice, she even added to God's command. God never said they couldn't touch it. He only said not to eat from it. When you're on the defensive, you start embellishing, over-explaining, trying to justify what shouldn't need justification. And now, Satan had her exactly where he wanted her. She was engaging with him, reasoning with him, treating his question as legitimate when she should have recognized it as an attack. The conversation had shifted from, "Look at all God has given us," to, "Why is God holding out on us?" This is the same tactic predators use today. They plant a small seed of doubt. They get you to question what you thought you knew. They make you defend and explain yourself, and once you're explaining, you're already losing. But Satan wasn't done. He was about to make his boldest move yet. Satan looked at Eve with total confidence and declared, "You won't die. God knows that when you eat from that tree, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." Stop and absorb what just happened. Satan called God a liar. He accused the Creator of being jealous, manipulative, and insecure. He painted God as a tyrant who was threatened by his own creation, someone so petty that he'd lie to keep them beneath him. It was the most vicious character assassination in history. Satan took God's loving protection, his one boundary designed to keep them safe, and twisted it into evidence of divine oppression, and he offered himself as proof. Satan claimed he'd eaten from the forbidden fruit and gained the power of speech, wisdom, and advancement. "Look at me," he essentially said. "I'm better for it. God's warning isn't real. It's just fear-mongering to keep you from reaching your potential." Eve had never heard anyone question God's truthfulness before. It shook her. She looked at the tree with new eyes. The fruit was beautiful. It looked nutritious. The serpent seemed fine, even enhanced. Maybe God didn't mean they'd die immediately. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe the serpent was right, and this was the key to a higher existence. Satan had successfully gotten Eve to distrust God's love and doubt God's wisdom. He'd planted irreverent curiosity in her mind, a restless, inquisitive desire to uncover secrets that God had deliberately withheld for her protection. And the more she thought about it, the more the fruit seemed to promise exactly what she suddenly wanted. wisdom, enlightenment, equality with God. This is the lie Satan has been selling from that day to this one, that disobeying God is actually the path to progression, that breaking his boundaries will open your eyes and elevate you, that the rules are just there to hold you back from your true potential, and people are still falling for it. But what Satan didn't tell Eve, what he hid behind his promises of advancement, was what he'd actually lost by rebelling. He'd found sin to result in infinite loss, but he concealed his own misery to drag Eve into the same position, and she believed him. Eve reached out. Her fingers touched the fruit. Nothing happened. She plucked it from the branch. Still nothing. She brought it to her lips and took a bite. At first, Eve felt nothing bad. In fact, she felt exhilarated. There was a vivifying power, a sense of entering a higher state of existence. She seemed to feel more alive, more aware. The serpent had been right, or so it seemed. There was no instant death, no lightning bolt, no obvious curse. Just this thrilling sensation that she'd crossed a threshold into greater knowledge. And because she felt no immediate evidence of God's displeasure, because she instead felt this delicious, exhilarating influence thrilling every faculty with new life, she made a devastating decision. She went to find Adam. When she found him, she was in a state of strange, unnatural excitement, her hands filled with the forbidden fruit. She told him everything that had happened. She repeated the serpent's words. She urged him to eat, assuring him they wouldn't die. Adam's face was immediately filled with sadness and horror. He recognized what had happened. This was the foe the angels had warned them about, and by God's decree, Eve would now have to die. Adam faced an impossible choice. He understood that Eve had transgressed the only command God had given them as a test of their love and fidelity. But he couldn't bear the thought of separation from her. She was part of himself. How could he endure losing her? Here's what's tragic. Adam didn't realize that the same infinite power that had created him from dust, that had given him Eve as a companion, could provide another if necessary. But in his mind, no blessing outweighed the potential loss of this one relationship. So he made a conscious, deliberate decision. He chose to share her fate. If she would die, he would die with her. Love, or what he convinced himself was love, overrode his loyalty to God, his gratitude to his Creator, everything. He seized the fruit and ate. At first, Adam imagined himself entering a higher state of existence, just like Eve had. But within moments, everything changed. Terror filled him. The mild, uniform air that had always comforted them suddenly felt cold. The love and peace that had surrounded them vanished, replaced by a crushing sense of sin, dread of the future, and a nakedness of soul they'd never experienced. Satan exulted in his success. He had tempted Eve to distrust God's love, to doubt his wisdom, and through her influence, he'd caused Adam's fall. But here's something crucial you need to understand. When Eve ate the fruit, sin hadn't actually entered the world yet. Eden was still intact. It was Adam's choice that opened the floodgates. Look at Romans 5, verse 12. Through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. Not through Eve, through Adam. His decision to follow her, driven by love that twisted into idolatry, was the moment everything broke. The robe of light that had clothed them, a visible manifestation of their innocence and God's presence, gone. For the first time, they saw each other as physically naked, and shame flooded them. They frantically grabbed fig leaves and sewed them together, trying to cover what couldn't be covered by physical clothing. Then they heard it. The sound of God walking in the garden, coming for their daily time together. The sound that had always brought joy, now for some reason brought terror. They ran and hid among the trees, as if the Creator who made every atom of their being wouldn't know exactly where they were. "Where are you?" God called out. It wasn't a question of location. It was an invitation to come clean, to step out of hiding, to confess what had happened. But instead of humility, instead of taking responsibility, Adam blamed Eve, and he blamed God. "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate." What a sad moment. He who had deliberately chosen to forfeit God's approval, his home in paradise, and eternal life out of love for Eve, now turned around and made her responsible. He even made God responsible. The woman you gave me. As if saying, this is your design flaw, not my rebellion. So awful is the power of sin. And Eve, when asked, she blamed the serpent. Why did you create the serpent? Why did you let him into Eden? These were the questions implied in her excuse. Both of them charged God with responsibility for their own choices. This spirit of self-justification? It originated with Satan, the father of lies. And the moment Adam and Eve yielded to his influence, they inherited it. Instead of humbly confessing, they shielded themselves by casting blame on others, on circumstances, on God himself, making even his blessings an occasion to murmur against him. Sound familiar? This is exactly how we behave today. At this time, the damage was done. The spirit of self-justification that Satan had pioneered in heaven had now infected humanity, and God had to pronounce judgment. God turned to the serpent first. He cursed it above all creatures. It would crawl on its belly and eat dust all its days. What had been the most beautiful creature would become the most despised. But then God said something that Satan must have heard with horror. I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Right there, in the moment of humanity's fall, God promised humanity's rescue. From the woman would come a descendant who would destroy Satan. Yes, Satan would wound him, strike his heel, but this coming one would deliver a fatal blow to the serpent's head. It was the first prophecy of Jesus. The rescue mission was announced way before Adam and Eve even left the garden, but there were still consequences. To Eve, God explained that childbirth would now involve terrible pain. Her relationship with Adam would be marked by struggle and hierarchy instead of equal partnership. Not because God was being vindictive, but because this is what a world infected by sin looks like. To Adam, God revealed that the ground itself would now resist him. Work would become toil. He'd sweat and strain all his life against thorns and thistles, and at the end, he'd return to the dust he came from. Death would claim him, and they had to leave Eden. If they ate from the tree of life now, in their fallen state, they'd live forever in misery and sin. So angels with flaming swords were posted at the entrance. Getting kicked out of paradise was actually an act of mercy, as brutal as it felt. Satan's tactics haven't evolved because they don't need to. Isolation still works. Questioning God's character still works. Making sin look beautiful still works. But so does God. Eve was isolated, deceived, and broken. Yet even in her shame, God came searching, already carrying a solution. The enemy still uses the same playbook today, but so does God. Still searching, still covering what we can't fix, still offering redemption that was promised before humanity ever left the garden. But here's what Satan didn't count on. God wasn't caught off guard. Unlike you, me, or any created being, Lucifer included, God didn't discover the fall in real time. He didn't pause, didn't panic. He didn't start figuring out a backup plan. The Bible says something that honestly shook me the first time I saw it. Revelation chapter 13, verse 8, calls Jesus the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Let that sink in. The last book of the Bible tells us the rescue plan existed before the first sin, before Eden, before Adam, before humanity was even created. When I encountered that, it was terrifying and fascinating at the same time. Because when Adam and Eve fell, heaven didn't scramble, heaven moved. And what heaven decided, when Christ stepped forward, causing the universe, together with the loyal angels, to go silent. What happened immediately after the fall of man is something most people have never been told, and that's what we're unpacking next. Click here to see how fast heaven responded. You definitely don't want to miss it.